November 12, 1944, 9:41 a.m. Over the frozen waters of Tromsø Fjord, deep inside the Arctic Circle, the first 12,000-pound tallboy bomb falls away from a British Lancaster bomber. Below, anchored in the Norwegian fjord, sits the German battleship Tirpitz, Hitler's unsinkable super battleship. The monster that destroyed convoy PQ-17 without firing a shot. The floating fortress that survived 33 Allied attacks and kept coming back. The bomb accelerates downward, spinning, stabilizing, reaching near supersonic speed. Inside Tirpitz, 1,700 German sailors man their battle stations, anti-aircraft guns blazing at the sky. This moment, this single bomb falling through clear Arctic air, represents the culmination of 3 years of obsession. Churchill was so fixated on destroying this ship that the shortest memo he wrote during the entire war was just 3 words: "Where is Tirpitz?" This is the story of how ordinary men, kids barely out of school, faced down the most terrifying warship ever built, and won. But first, understanding what made this ship so feared requires going back to the day it was born. April 1st, 1939, Wilhelmshaven shipyard, Germany. The launch of the Tirpitz becomes worldwide news. In a cinema in New York, a teenage Tony Iverson watches the newsreel footage with his girlfriend, mesmerized by images of this colossal warship sliding into the water. "I remember seeing this battleship, this huge thing," Iverson would recall decades later. "I had no idea when I saw this that one day I might be linked with Tirpitz." Adolf Hitler watches the same launch in person, presenting Admiral Erich Raeder with an ornate, icon-studded navy blue baton, the first Grand Admiral since Kaiser Wilhelm II. The ceremony is elaborate, the symbolism unmistakable. Germany's navy has returned to greatness. The new battleship bears the name of Grand Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, architect of Imperial Germany's World War I naval power. The specifications alone explain why Allied intelligence officers felt their blood run cold when the first detailed reports crossed their desks. The raw numbers: 52,600 tons fully loaded, heavier than 350 Sherman tanks, length 251 meters, nearly as long as 3 soccer fields placed end to end, bristling with enough firepower to level a city block. The engines generated 163,026 shaft horsepower from 12 Wagner high-pressure steam boilers. When those turbines fired up, the sound could be heard from miles away, a roar that signaled death approaching. Maximum speed, 30 knots, faster than any British battleship. But raw size wasn't what kept British naval planners awake at night. The armament system: 8 38cm 15-inch cannons, each capable of hurling an 800-kilogram shell 22 miles far beyond the horizon, allowing Tirpitz to sink enemy ships before they even saw it coming. The Germans named these weapons Anton, Bruno, Caesar, and Dora, family names for executioners wrapped in 360 millimeters of armor plating. The secondary batteries included 12 5.9-inch guns and 16 4.1-inch guns in dual-purpose mounts. The ship carried 4 Araudo R-119 seaplanes for reconnaissance, and the armor, the belt, measured 320 millimeters of hardened Krupp steel at its thickest points, with deck armor ranging from 50 to 120 millimeters. Allied naval architects studying intelligence reports reached the same grim conclusion: conventional weapons couldn't sink this ship. The strategic context was terrifying. Tirpitz and her sister ship Bismarck represented Germany's answer to an arms race Britain had helped create. After World War I, the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 capped warship tonnage at 35,000 tons. Everyone agreed to slow the competition. But when Japan withdrew from the treaty in 1937, the ceiling jumped to 45,000 tons. Germany saw its opening. Admiral Raeder presented Hitler with Plan Z, a blueprint for crushing Royal Navy supremacy: 10 super battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, 15 pocket battleships, 250 U-boats, over 100 destroyers and cruisers. The target completion date: 1948. Hitler's impatience killed Plan Z before it matured. He started the war in 1939, instead of waiting until 1945 as Raeder wanted. Resources got diverted to tanks and planes for the Eastern Front, but Tirpitz still got built, and now Britain had to deal with it. The strategic implications were clear and immediate. Britain's survival depended on shipping lanes. Everything from troops to food to fuel came across the Atlantic from America. If Tirpitz operated freely in those shipping lanes, the calculations were brutally simple. Britain could lose the war before a single German soldier set foot on English soil. May 24, 1941. Denmark Strait. Between Greenland and Iceland, HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy for 20 years, encounters Bismarck, Tirpitz's sister ship. The Hood wasn't just any warship. She was the flagship, the symbol of British naval supremacy. Measuring 860 feet long, displacing more than 42,000 tons, capable of speeds exceeding 30 knots. For 2 decades, she'd been considered the mightiest warship afloat. When foreign dignitaries visited Britain, they toured the Hood. When Britain needed to project power, they sent the Hood. The engagement began at 5:52 a.m., when Hood opened fire at a range of approximately 14 miles. The British squadron spotted the Germans at 5:37 a.m., but the Germans were already aware of their presence. At 6 a.m., a salvo from Prince Eugen struck Hood's boat deck, starting fires near the mainmast. At 6:01 a.m., 9 minutes into the battle, a shell from Bismarck, firing from more than 9 miles distant, penetrated Hood's deck armor. The explosion was catastrophic. A column of flame shot skyward, momentarily blinding crew members on the nearby Prince of Wales. The 860-foot battlecruiser broke in half. The bow section rose nearly vertical before sliding beneath the waves. The entire middle section had simply vanished. 3 minutes. That's how long it took for the mighty Hood to disappear completely. Of 1,418 men aboard, 1,415 died. Only 3 survived: Ordinary Signalman Ted Briggs, Midshipman William Dundas, and able seaman Robert Tilburn. Destroyer HMS Electra rescued them 2 hours later, pulling them from the freezing water just as hypothermia began shutting down their bodies. The psychological shockwave rippled through the Royal Navy instantly. Captain Ralph Kerr, one of the 3 survivors, later testified before an Admiralty inquiry. "We never had a chance. The shell penetration was catastrophic. One moment we were engaging the enemy, the next the ship was breaking apart beneath our feet. If Bismarck could obliterate the mighty Hood in 6 minutes, what would Tirpitz accomplish?" The Royal Navy hunted Bismarck for 3 days across the North Atlantic. Swordfish torpedo bombers from HMS Ark Royal finally jammed her rudder with a torpedo hit. Battleships HMS King George V and HMS Rodney closed in for the kill. On May 27th, sustained bombardment reduced Bismarck to a burning wreck before her crew scuttled the ship. 1 threat eliminated. But Tirpitz remained, bigger, more advanced, and now the Germans knew exactly what these super battleships could do. The lesson was clear: conventional naval engagement with these vessels was suicide. New tactics would be required. June 1942. Winston Churchill makes a promise to Stalin. Britain will maintain the Arctic convoys, delivering essential supplies to the Soviet Union. Without these shipments, the Soviet war effort could collapse. The stakes are immense. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces are fighting desperately to halt the German advance. Every ton of supplies that reaches the Soviets means more resistance, more time for the Allies to build strength, more hope for ultimate victory. The largest Arctic convoy of the war assembles: 35 merchant ships escorted by 6 destroyers, 4 corvettes, 3 minesweepers, 4 armed trawlers, 2 anti-aircraft ships, and 2 submarines. Distant covering forces include the battleship USS Washington and HMS Duke of York. It's one of the most heavily protected convoys ever assembled. The convoy, designated PQ-17, departs Iceland on June 27, 1942, bound for the Soviet port of Arkhangelsk. For the first few days, the passage proceeds relatively smoothly despite German air attacks. Then, on July 4th, everything changes. British intelligence reports based on intercepted German signals and reconnaissance indicate that Tirpitz has left its anchorage. The battleship, along with heavy cruisers Admiral Hipper and Admiral Scheer, is reportedly heading to intercept the convoy. At the Admiralty in London, First Sea Lord Admiral Sir Dudley Pound faces an agonizing decision. If Tirpitz engages the convoy in concentrated formation, the German super battleship could annihilate the entire force. The convoy's escorts, destroyers and cruisers would be outgunned and destroyed. The merchant ships would be defenseless. Pound makes a decision that would haunt the Royal Navy for years: scatter the convoy. Every ship for itself. At 9:11 p.m. on July 4th, the order arrives. Convoy is to scatter. The reasoning seems sound on paper. Tirpitz can't hunt down 35 scattered ships across the Arctic Ocean. At least some vessels might survive to deliver their crucial cargo to the embattled Soviets. The result is catastrophic. German aircraft find the isolated merchant vessels first. Junkers Ju-88 bombers and Heinkel He-11 torpedo bombers attack ship after ship. Then U-boats move in, picking off stragglers. Without the protection of the escort screen, the merchant ships are defenseless targets. Over the next week, the slaughter continues. 24 Allied ships gone. Of the original 35 vessels, only 11 reach Arkhangelsk. The losses are staggering: 3,350 vehicles, 210 aircraft, 430 tanks, and 99,316 tons of other cargo, including food, ammunition, and medical supplies sent to the bottom. 153 merchant sailors dead. Americans, British, Dutch, Norwegians, men who volunteered to sail into the Arctic knowing the dangers. The most infuriating detail: Tirpitz never showed up, never fired a shot, never even got close to the convoy's position. German Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz had vacillated about deploying Tirpitz, worried about aircraft carrier threats. By the time Hitler finally approved the operation on July 5th at 11:37 a.m., it was too late. The convoy was already scattered and being destroyed by aircraft and U-boats. Just the threat of Tirpitz in the area was enough to doom an entire supply operation. Merchant sailor Thomas Whitmore, who survived aboard the SS Ocean Freedom, wrote in his journal, "We scattered at 10 p.m. on July 4th. By dawn, we could see smoke from burning ships on 3 horizons. We knew we were next. The waiting was worse than the attack when it came." These merchant sailors, many of them civilian volunteers, had sailed through U-boat-infested waters to deliver supplies that could help defeat Hitler's Germany. They knew the risks. They sailed anyway. Winston Churchill called PQ-17 one of the most melancholy naval episodes in the whole of the war. The strategic implications rippled outward. Every convoy now required massive escorts. Destroyers that should be hunting U-boats were watching for Tirpitz. Reconnaissance aircraft burned fuel monitoring Norwegian fjords. Entire battle groups tied up countering a threat that rarely left port. This was fleet in being, power so overwhelming it controls the battlefield by simply existing. As long as Tirpitz remained afloat, it strangled Allied operations. British cryptanalysts had cracked the German Enigma code, providing intelligence on Tirpitz's location and movements. They knew where the ship was, what it was doing, when it might move. But knowing where it was didn't solve the fundamental problem: how to sink something that seemed truly indestructible. For Churchill, the answer was clear: Tirpitz had to die. Between 1942 and 1944, Britain mounted operation after operation against Tirpitz. The ship had become more than a military target. It represented German naval power, the ability to project force across the Atlantic, the threat to Allied unity. Each attack failed or achieved only temporary damage, but the British kept trying. October 31st, 1942, operation title deployed Chariots, 2-man torpedoes that commandos would ride through freezing Norwegian waters to attach explosives to Tirpitz's hull underwater. The concept was brilliant. The execution proved impossible. 6 British commandos, all volunteers who understood they might not return, deployed from a submarine miles offshore. These men knew what they were facing: the most heavily defended battleship on Earth, in one of the most hostile environments imaginable. North Sea currents, stronger than anything anticipated, grabbed the Chariots immediately. 2 were torn away and lost. The remaining teams fought malfunctioning equipment as freezing water degraded seals and mechanisms. Dawn approached. Detection became certain. The commandos made the brutal calculation. Mission failure was certain, but they might survive if they aborted immediately. They abandoned the Chariots and swam back miles through water cold enough to kill to the waiting submarine. Tirpitz sat untouched, having defeated another Allied attempt, but the British didn't give up. They couldn't afford to. September 1943. Operation Source deployed 6 X-class midget submarines, tiny vessels barely 40 feet long, each carrying 2 tons of Amatex explosive to be dropped beneath Tirpitz's keel. The crews knew the odds. Previous intelligence suggested the defenses around Tirpitz were nearly impenetrable. Anti-submarine nets, patrol boats, mines, shore batteries. But stopping this ship justified the risk. 3 X-craft were lost before reaching the target area. X-5 vanished, fate unknown to this day, her crew almost certainly killed by German defenses. X-6, commanded by Lieutenant Donald Cameron, and X-7, commanded by Lieutenant Godfrey Place, pressed on through minefields and anti-submarine nets toward Tirpitz, anchored in Kofjord, Norway. The technical challenge was extraordinary. These submarines needed to navigate blind through multiple layers of anti-torpedo nets, thick steel cables that could rip a hull apart if the submarine became entangled. Both X-6 and X-7 made it through. They positioned themselves beneath Tirpitz's massive hull. At approximately 8 a.m. on September 22nd, both submarines dropped their charges. Then they tried to escape. X-7 became entangled in the nets. X-6's systems failed. Both submarines were forced to surface around 8:40 a.m. Their crews were captured immediately at gunpoint. The British submariners had failed to escape, but they'd succeeded in their mission. At 8:12 a.m., 12 minutes after the British crews were captured, the charges detonated. Even from the deck where they were being held prisoner, the British crews felt the explosion through their boots. Tirpitz lurched sideways. Alarms screamed throughout the ship. Water poured in through ruptured hull plating. Damage reports showed catastrophic results. Fuel tanks ruptured, bulkheads buckled, generators failed, turret door knocked completely off its bearings, a 1,300-ton turret assembly torn from its rotating mechanism. The ship's reconnaissance seaplanes destroyed. Repairs would take 6 months minimum. Lieutenant Cameron and Lieutenant Place both received the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest honor for valor. They spent the rest of the war in German POW camps. They'd proven something crucial. Tirpitz could be damaged. The unsinkable battleship was vulnerable. Courage and innovation could strike at the heart of German naval power. Between April and August 1944, the Royal Navy launched repeated carrier-based air attacks, Operations Tungsten, Planet, Brawn, Tiger Claw, Mascot, and multiple Goodwood raids. Fleet Air Arm Fairey Barracuda dive bombers struck repeatedly, but the slow aircraft gave defenders time to generate artificial smoke screens. The bombs that did hit lacked the power to penetrate Tirpitz's armored deck. By September 1944, RAF intelligence officers reviewing 3 years of failed operations reached a conclusion. Conventional bombing couldn't sink this ship, but Britain had an engineer who specialized in the impossible. Barnes Wallis, the engineer who designed the bouncing bombs that breached the Ruhr dams in 1943, understood what was needed to kill Tirpitz. The battleship represented more than steel and guns. It represented Hitler's ability to threaten Allied convoys, to tie up British naval resources, to prolong the war. Every month Tirpitz remained afloat meant more Allied sailors at risk, more convoys threatened, more resources diverted. Wallis created a weapon specifically designed to end this threat. He called it the Tall Boy. The specifications revealed why this weapon might succeed where everything else had failed. 12 feet long, 12,000 pounds, 6 tons of Tirpitz D1 explosive, encased in a specially designed armor-piercing shell. But the revolutionary aspect wasn't size or weight, it was penetration capability. The Tall Boy wasn't designed to explode on impact. The bomb was engineered to punch through decks, through armor plate, through reinforced steel structure, penetrating deep into a ship's interior before detonating. The shaped charge would then create a shockwave so powerful it could crack a vessel's keel or generate an earthquake effect that tore ships apart from inside. The aerodynamic design with offset fins causing it to spin as it fell allowed it to reach speeds approaching 750 miles per hour in the final seconds of descent. The spinning stabilized the bomb's flight path, making it fly like a dart directly to its target without tumbling. When dropped from 14,000 feet or higher, the Tall Boy could penetrate through 16 feet of reinforced concrete or several feet of armor plating before exploding. Only one aircraft could carry it, the Avro Lancaster heavy bomber, and only after significant modifications. September 15, 1944. Operation Paravan launched from Jagodnik airfield in the Soviet Union, chosen because Tirpitz's anchorage at Kofjord, Norway, was beyond the range of bombers flying from Britain. 21 Lancasters from 617 Squadron and 9 Squadron, each carrying a single Tall Boy, took off at dawn after a grueling 1,100-mile flight from Scotland the previous day. Wing Commander J.B. Willie Tate led the formation. These were Britain's elite bomber crews, veterans of the Dam Busters raid and countless operations over occupied Europe. They understood what was at stake. The approach to Kufjord required precision timing. The bombers needed to arrive before German smoke generators could obscure the target. At 8 a.m., the Lancasters reached their bombing altitude, approximately 14,000 feet. The fjord stretched below them, Tirpitz clearly visible anchored near the rocky shore. German smoke generators activated immediately, but the Lancaster bombardiers had brief windows between the smoke clouds. One tall boy hit. The bomb struck Tirpitz's bow, penetrating through the deck before detonating deep inside the ship. The explosion was catastrophic. Smoke poured from multiple deck levels. Fires erupted throughout the forward sections. The bow structure buckled. Water flooded into compartments through the massive rupture. Reconnaissance photos showed Tirpitz listing, smoke pouring from the bow, speed reduced to barely 10 knots, but not quite fatal. The battleship remained afloat. German engineers worked frantically for a month to get Tirpitz mobile enough to limp south to Tromsø. The damage was too severe for the ship to ever be combat ready again, but German High Command made a decision. Tirpitz would be moved to Tromsø and used as a floating artillery battery. The move to Tromsø proved to be a fatal mistake. Every movement was tracked through Enigma intercepts. British intelligence knew exactly where the wounded ship was going, and Tromsø was just barely within range of bombers flying from Scotland. The RAF knew the tall boy worked. They just needed one more shot. October 29th, 1944. The RAF prepared for a direct attack from Scotland on Tirpitz's new anchorage at Tromsø. The challenge was brutal. The round-trip distance was approximately 2,200 miles at the absolute limit of a heavily loaded Lancaster's range. The prize was worth the risk. Sinking Tirpitz would free up enormous Allied naval resources, allow convoys to proceed with lighter escorts, eliminate a major threat once and for all. The bombers underwent drastic modifications. Armor plating removed, gun turrets stripped out, every ounce of excess weight eliminated to maximize fuel capacity and range. They had to reduce the weight, so they took out the mid-upper turret in its entirety, recalled one crew member. They took the guns out of the front turret and reduced the ammunition in the rear turret to only essentials. Extra fuel tanks were installed, dangerous work that meant flying with vaporized fuel throughout the aircraft. One spark could vaporize a Lancaster and its 7-man crew. It was so dangerous that ground crew had to wear plimsolls because of the danger of a spark if they wore their boots, one engineer explained. That would probably blow up the whole aircraft, at least one, perhaps several more around it. The modifications worked, but they left the Lancasters vulnerable. Without mid-upper turrets and with reduced armament, the bombers would be nearly defenseless if German fighters intercepted them. 38 Lancasters took off from Lossiemouth in northern Scotland before dawn on October 29th. The flight north took hours. Navigation required flying at low level across the North Sea to avoid German radar, then climbing to cross the Norwegian mountains, using neutral Sweden to mask the approach. Just before reaching the target at Tromsø, overcast skies obscured the fjord. The Lancaster bombardiers searched desperately for gaps in the clouds. A few bombs dropped blindly. One tall boy exploded near Tirpitz, causing additional hull damage, but weather prevented accurate bombing. 38 Lancasters returned to Scotland, fuel gauges reading dangerously low. Several aircraft barely made it back to base. The mission was classified as a failure. Tirpitz remained afloat, but British determination hadn't wavered. If weather had prevented success, they would try again when conditions improved. November 12, 1944. Early morning. 32 Lancaster bombers from 9 Squadron and 617 Squadron prepared for takeoff from Lossiemouth and Milltown airfields in northern Scotland. Each aircraft carried a single 12,000-pound tallboy bomb. Tony Iverson, now 24 years old, had joined 617 Squadron after flying Spitfires in the Battle of Britain. He'd seen London burn under Luftwaffe bombing. He'd watched friends die fighting Germany. Every young man in the world wanted to fly, he recalled decades later. But it wasn't just about adventure. It was about defending our country, protecting our families. Frank Tilley had left university to join the RAF. I didn't want to live under occupation. I wanted to fight back. Basil Fish had faked his eye test to get into the RAF. My country needed me. Britain needed every man who could fight. These young men, barely out of their teens, were about to attempt one of the most crucial missions of the war: sink Tirpitz. free up Allied naval resources, help end the threat to convoys bringing supplies to the Soviets. The Lancasters lifted off in darkness, turning northeast toward the Norwegian Sea. The round-trip journey would cover approximately 2,200 miles, more than 13 hours of flying time. Fuel calculations were razor-thin. The formation flew past the Shetland Islands and continued northeast toward occupied Norway. At 64 degrees north, they turned eastward, crossing the Norwegian coast at low level through a gap in German radar coverage. They climbed to clear the mountains, then flew on toward Sweden. Turning north just inside the Swedish border, they rendezvoused at the assembly point, a lake approximately 100 miles southeast of Tromsø. As Arctic dawn broke, the weather was perfect. Crystal clear skies, no clouds, unlimited visibility. Wing Commander Willie Tate, leading the formation, knew this meant perfect bombing conditions. The Lancasters turned toward Tromsø, toward their target, toward the chance to strike a decisive blow. November 12, 1944, 9:35 a.m. The Lancasters began their bombing run over Tromsø Fjord. Below them, Tirpitz sat anchored, Hitler's last operational major surface warship. For 3 years, this ship had terrorized Allied convoys, strangled supply lines to the Soviet Union, tied up enormous British naval resources. Now 32 British bomber crews were about to end that threat forever. The battleship's massive 15-inch guns swiveled skyward, capital ship cannons designed for naval combat, now firing desperately at aircraft. The shells burst in orange-brown clouds at exactly the altitude where the Lancasters were flying. "You have to hand it to the German gunners," one crew member said. They were good. The flak was precisely calibrated, but they were a little bit early. The bursts were in front of us by a matter of yards. The Lancasters pressed through the barrage. Bombardiers lined up their stabilized automatic bomb sights, calculating for wind, altitude, target movement. At 9:41 a.m., the first tall boy dropped. Flight Lieutenant Tony Iverson focused on keeping his aircraft absolutely steady. I had to get that aeroplane positioned perfectly so the bomb would hit that battleship. From 15,000 feet it looked tiny, but I knew what it represented. The threat to our convoys, everything we'd been fighting against for 3 years. The tall boys fell, spinning as they accelerated toward their target. The first bomb penetrated Tirpitz's deck between turrets Anton and Bruno. It failed to detonate, a dud, but the structural damage from the impact was severe. At 9:42 a.m., a second tall boy hit amidships between the aircraft catapult and the funnel. This one detonated. The explosion tore a massive hole through Tirpitz's port side and bottom, a gaping wound measuring approximately 200 feet long. The entire section of belt armor was obliterated. Inside the ship, the devastation was catastrophic. The blast ruptured fuel tanks, ignited fires, destroyed electrical systems. Water poured in through the enormous breach. A possible third tall boy struck near turret Caesar. 2 more exploded close enough to cause severe underwater damage, their shockwaves buckling hull plates and cracking internal bulkheads. Within minutes, the battleship began listing to port. The list increased rapidly. 5 degrees, 10 degrees, 20 degrees. At 9:50 a.m., 9 minutes after the first bomb hit, one of Tirpitz's forward magazines detonated. The explosion was massive, sending a column of smoke and flame more than 300 feet into the air. The list increased to 40 degrees, then 60 degrees. At 9:52 a.m., 11 minutes after the first bomb dropped, Tirpitz rolled completely over and capsized. The keel pointed at the sky. The massive hull settled into the shallow water of Tromsø Fjord, coming to rest with the starboard side exposed above the waterline. Flight Lieutenant Tony Iverson, circling overhead, watched. We flew in at 50 feet and watched as Tirpitz heeled over to port, ever so slowly. After 3 years of trying, we'd finally done it. Churchill's Beast was dead. All 32 British aircraft returned safely to Scotland. Not a single RAF crew member was killed or wounded. The mission was a complete success. November 12, 1944, 9:52 a.m. As Tirpitz capsized, approximately 1,700 German crew members were aboard. Between 940 and 1,000 of them died when the ship rolled over. Most died trapped inside the capsized hull. As the ship rolled, men in lower compartments found themselves in complete darkness, waist-deep in freezing water, with the ceiling now beneath their feet. Karl-Hein Kierling, a 21-year-old German sailor, was on shore that morning, organizing resupply. "I saw not the explosion from the hit on the ship, but I felt the quake," he recalled. The ship began to list. It goes so and so, and at last we're hanging in the railing. From shore, rescue crews could hear men trapped inside, pounding on the hull. German rescue teams worked frantically, using cutting torches to burn holes through the exposed hull plating. Over several hours, 87 men were pulled from the wreck through holes cut in the hull. But for most trapped inside, rescue came too late. All 32 British aircraft returned safely to Scotland. 0 RAF casualties. The contrast was stark, but this was the arithmetic of war. The British had spent 3 years trying to sink this ship, countless operations, resources diverted, risks taken. Now the threat was finally eliminated. The destruction of Tirpitz sent shockwaves through German military leadership. Hitler's vaunted unsinkable battleship lay capsized in a Norwegian fjord. The Kriegsmarine had lost its last major surface combatant. The ship that was supposed to strangle Allied convoys was gone. Someone had to be blamed. Major Heinrich Oehler, commander of the Luftwaffe fighter squadron at Bardufoss, was court-martialed and charged with failing to protect Tirpitz. He was convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison, though released after only 1 month and reassigned. Later investigations revealed the failure went deeper than one officer. German forces couldn't communicate directly between services. Messages had to go through rigid command channels. Confusion about whether the Lancasters were heading to the Soviet Union or toward Tirpitz meant vital minutes were lost. One intriguing theory emerged after the war. Lieutenant Karl Heinrich Westphalener, a German officer stationed at a radar installation on Andoya Island, may have deliberately delayed transmitting information about the approaching Lancasters. After the war, a letter surfaced describing his anti-Nazi activities. The Norwegian resistance smuggled him out of Norway, something they wouldn't have done if his credentials weren't genuine. Whether through sabotage, communication failures, or confusion, the result was the same. The Lancasters completed their mission unopposed by fighters. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz ordered an inquiry into why Tirpitz had capsized. The investigation concluded that dredging operations to create a protective sandbank had been only half complete. The tollboy near misses had cratered the seabed, removing what little protection existed. When news reached London that Tirpitz had finally capsized, Winston Churchill immediately sent a telegram to Stalin. RAF bombers have sunk the Tirpitz. Let us rejoice together. The message reminded the Soviets that Britain was fulfilling its commitment to support the fight against Germany. Arctic convoys could now proceed with greater safety. Supplies would flow more freely to Soviet forces fighting the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. For the young airmen of 9 and 617 squadrons, there was relief, celebration, and exhaustion. We really didn't know we'd sunk it until we got back to base and they sent out a signal to say it had been destroyed, recalled one pilot. We felt marvelous. We'd finally killed Churchill's beast. The celebration at RAF Lossiemouth that night was jubilant. Beer flowing freely, wing commander in the middle of it, and a great deal of laughter and shouting, one crew member recalled. We'd been 3 times after that thing. We'd finally done it. Frank Tilley and Basil Fish celebrated their weekend leave with a trip to the London Palladium to see comedian Tommy Trinder. Tommy Trinder made a joke about the Tirpitz. We sat there feeling quite pleased with ourselves. But even in victory, there was a recognition of the cost. The enthusiasm was tempered by the knowledge that more than 1,000 men, most of them young, like themselves, had died that day. It's quite an interesting experience to talk about something that happened very nearly 70 years ago, Tony Iverson reflected in 2014, at age 94. The victory had come at tremendous cost, not just the lives lost that day, but the years of operations, the aircraft destroyed in previous attempts, the crews killed in 33 failed attacks before this final success. The sinking of Tirpitz fundamentally altered the strategic balance in European waters. For 3 years, the battleship's mere existence had consumed enormous Allied resources. 2 British battleships, an aircraft carrier, and supporting naval vessels had been kept in northern waters solely to counter the Tirpitz threat. These ships could now be redeployed. The Arctic convoys to the Soviet Union, which had operated under the constant shadow of Tirpitz since 1942, could now proceed with reduced escort requirements. More supplies reached Soviet forces fighting Germany on the Eastern Front. The psychological impact was equally significant. Tirpitz had represented German naval power and prestige. Its destruction demonstrated that no target was beyond Allied reach, no matter how heavily defended. Some historians have questioned whether the final attacks on Tirpitz were necessary. By November 1944, the ship was already crippled and would never fight again. But this argument misses the point. As long as Tirpitz existed, it tied up Allied intelligence resources, reconnaissance assets, and planning efforts. The British couldn't know for certain how damaged the ship was. The symbol mattered as much as the reality. Churchill's determination to sink Tirpitz wasn't excessive, it was strategic clarity. Every German weapon destroyed, every capability eliminated, every symbol crushed, brought victory closer. The decision to continue attacking made sense. This was total war. Half measures were unacceptable when fighting an enemy that had plunged Europe into unprecedented devastation. The capsized hull of Tirpitz remained in Tromsø fjord for years after the war ended. Between 1948 and 1957, Norwegian and German salvage crews slowly dismantled what remained. Cutting torches carved through the massive steel plates. Cranes lifted sections of armor, gun turrets, machinery. Much of the steel was melted down and repurposed. Some armor plates were sold to the Norwegian Public Roads Administration, which still uses them today to cover excavations on roads around Oslo. The battleship's armor now serving peaceful purposes. Other pieces became museum displays. The Tirpitz Museum at Kåfjord houses artifacts and photographs. A museum in Tromsø displays items recovered from the wreck. These museums document not just the ship, but the Allied determination to eliminate major threats, the courage of British submariners and airmen who attacked repeatedly despite enormous risks, the technological innovation that finally achieved victory. The ship that Hitler called Unsinkable was sunk. The weapon designed to strangle Allied convoys was destroyed. The symbol of German naval power was reduced to scrap metal and museum pieces. 70 years after the raid, an extraordinary friendship had developed between two old warriors, Tony Iverson, the British Lancaster pilot, and Kurt Schultz, the German fighter pilot who nearly intercepted him that day, became close friends in their final years. Tony was not too enthused about meeting a damn German pilot at first, Schultz recalled with a laugh. We were a bit wary of each other for quite a while, but then we had a drink and things loosened up. We never talked about the war much, Schultz explained. We talked about our families, our lives, what we'd learned. In November 2014, they spoke one final time, just after Iverson's 94th birthday. I liked Kurt, Iverson said. We got to know each other quite well. The friendship represented something profound, that individual men on both sides were human beings, regardless of the causes they served. But it didn't erase the moral distinctions of the war itself. It's a situation where we as human beings finally come through, Schultz reflected. 1,000 Germans died. That's something we have to consider. Crazy war. When asked about his memories, Iverson's thoughts were complex but clear. I think all war is dreadful. I do really, he said in one of his last interviews. But if it came again, we'd have to do the same again. You couldn't have the Nazis, could you? No way. That moral clarity defined the generation that fought World War II. They understood the difference between the aggressor and the defender, between tyranny and freedom, between a war of conquest and a war of survival. The words from memorial services stayed with the survivors. They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. It sticks in your throat a bit, one veteran said quietly. The raid that finally sank Tirpitz remains one of the outstanding achievements of aerial warfare. Meticulous planning, precision execution, technological innovation, and determination. The operation demonstrated several lessons. The obsolescence of the battleship. Tirpitz represented the pinnacle of battleship design, yet it was destroyed by aircraft carrying a single bomb each. The age of the battleship. Those massive floating fortresses that had dominated naval warfare since the late 1800s, died in Tromsø fjord. The future belonged to aircraft carriers, submarines and air power, the power of precision weapons. The Tallboy bomb pioneered concepts that would define modern warfare. Precision-guided munitions capable of destroying heavily defended targets that conventional weapons couldn't touch. The lineage from Tallboy runs through modern bunker-busting weapons to GPS-guided bombs. The importance of intelligence. Cracking the Enigma code allowed the Allies to track Tirpitz's every movement, to know when it was vulnerable, to time attacks for maximum effect. The raid succeeded partly because British intelligence knew exactly where Tirpitz was and what condition it was in. The cost of persistence. Churchill's determination, symbolized by that three-word memo, "Where is Tirpitz?" drove operations for 3 years. Sometimes in war, symbols matter as much as strategic reality. The refusal to accept failure, the willingness to try again after 32 failed attempts, ultimately brought victory. The human element. Behind all the technology, the strategy, the bombs and armor plate were human beings. Young men barely out of their teens following orders, fighting for their countries. Tony Iverson and Kurt Schultz becoming friends in old age demonstrates that former enemies can find common ground, but it doesn't erase the fundamental difference between fighting for freedom and fighting for conquest. Today, pieces of Tirpitz are scattered across Norway, incorporated into roads, museums, memorials. The ship that couldn't be sunk has been literally distributed across the landscape. But the story of Tirpitz is ultimately about the people. The British sailors who died on Hood, the merchant seamen who drowned after PQ-17 scattered, the X-craft crews who earned Victoria Crosses, the Lancaster crews who flew into flak storms. It's about young men like Tony Iverson, who watched newsreels in a New York cinema and never imagined he'd one day help sink that massive ship. About Frank Tilley and Basil Fish, university students who became bomber crew members. And yes, it's about the German sailors who died when Tirpitz capsized, young men like Karl-Heinz Kierling, who survived by chance of being on shore that morning. Men who served in Hitler's military, whether through conviction or conscription, and paid with their lives when the ship finally sank. The British airmen who sank Tirpitz deserve to be remembered for their courage, their skill, their determination. The German sailors who died deserve to be remembered as casualties of a war caused by a hideous regime. The human cost was real on both sides. Remember them, all of them. But remember also why the war was fought, and which side fought for freedom. If you liked this video, hit that like button so more people can discover these tales of courage against impossible odds, and tell us your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more stories of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges, because these aren't just tales of guns, bombs, and battleships. They're stories of courage, sacrifice, and the hard-won victory over tyranny that shaped the world we live in today.